Welcome back to Drowsy History. Or if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm very glad you found your way to this little corner of the internet. Before we begin, I want to ask you to do two things. First, if you haven't already subscribed, please do. It truly makes a difference for this channel, and it means more of these long, slow histories will find their way to you. Second, leave me a comment, just a quick one, nothing elaborate, telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every single one of them, and there's something about knowing that someone in Auckland or Oslo or Tennessee or Sao Paulo is drifting off to the same words that I find genuinely moving. Now, get comfortable, adjust your pillow, let your jaw unclench just a little, let your shoulders settle. There's nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to be for the next while. And if you fall asleep somewhere in the middle, excellent. That is the whole point. Tonight's story begins with a city, a real one, a city of between 11,000 and 20,000 people, depending on which historian you believe, sitting on a broad coastal plain in the shadow of a mountain that most of its residents had never seriously worried about, because why would you? The mountain had always been there. It was covered in vineyards. It was beautiful. And then, on the 24th of August, in the year 79 of the Common Era, or possibly the 23rd of October, as a newer theory suggests, it killed almost everyone in sight. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before the mountain killed the city was very much alive, and alive in ways that would surprise you, disturb you, and, in small, specific moments, feel unexpectedly, almost uncomfortably familiar. This is the story of what it was actually like to live in Pompeii, not the last day, not the catastrophe. The ordinary days before, the days you would have moved through as an ordinary resident, getting up, eating breakfast, going to work, arguing with your neighbor, going to the baths, coming home. We're going to do this right, from the moment your eyes open in the morning to the moment you lie down in the dark, and I'm going to tell you at each step exactly how and why, as a modern person, you would have struggled to survive it. Not the volcano, the life. Close your eyes whenever you're ready. Before we can walk through a day in Pompeii, we need to know who you are. And the answer to that question depended, in first century Roman society, on almost everything about the circumstances of your birth, more than talent, more than ambition, more than anything you might do or become. Pompeii was a Roman city, but it was not Rome. It had been Roman, officially Roman, subsumed into the Roman state since 89 BCE, when Sulla's legions crushed a revolt during the Social War, and the city was forced to give up its Oscan language, its independent political identity, and its separate legal status. The city the Romans absorbed was already old by then, founded by the Oscan-speaking Samnites, perhaps in the 7th or 6th century BCE, influenced heavily by the Greek settlements nearby at Herculaneum and Neapolis, carrying the marks of a dozen different cultural layers in its temples, its street grid, and the names of its gods. By the 1st century CE, Pompeii had been Roman for 150 years, and it wore its Romanness the way a provincial city wears a metropolitan style, enthusiastically, slightly imperfectly, with a local accent that kept showing through. So who were you? Let us say, for the purposes of this walk through a single day that you were a moderately prosperous, free person, not wealthy, not one of the great landowning families whose names appear on the inscriptions for public buildings and election notices that plaster the city's walls, but not poor either. You had a small workshop or a stall in the forum market. You produced something: pottery, textiles, bread, processed fish sauce, cooked food. You owned perhaps one or two enslaved people, which in the context of the Roman world was a marker of middling status rather than great wealth. You could read, at least well enough to navigate the basic texts of daily life, because Pompeii's literacy rate was, by ancient standards, relatively high. The walls are covered with graffiti, electoral endorsements, poems, insults, and commercial notices, and the sheer volume of this writing implies a population with at least basic literacy spread across the social spectrum. Your house was not the vast courtyard mansion, the domus, of a great family. It was something smaller, possibly a set of rooms above your workshop, or a modest dwelling off one of the city's side streets, with a small atrium open to the sky for light and ventilation and to catch rainwater in a cistern below. Your walls were plastered and painted. Nearly all Pompeian walls were plastered and painted, even modest ones, in shades of red and yellow and black, with simple decorative borders and perhaps a small mythological scene above the main panel. From the outside, your house gave almost nothing away. The typical Pompeian house presented a nearly blank facade to the street, with solid walls, perhaps a small window set high, and a doorway that led through a narrow entrance corridor into the world within. That corridor, the fosses, the city literally called it the throat of the house, was sometimes decorated with mosaics on the floor, including in several famous Pompeian examples the image of a dog rendered in black and white tesserae with the words Cave Canem, beware of the dog, inscribed above it. This was sometimes a genuine warning, because dogs were widely kept as both companions and guards, and sometimes a joke, because the dog depicted was clearly decorative rather than threatening. Romans had a sense of humor about their domestic spaces, and the threshold was a place they particularly liked to play with. It was a liminal zone, neither inside nor outside, and they ornamented it accordingly. Through the fosses, the house opened into the atrium. This was the heart of the Pompeian house, and it was nothing like what a modern person would expect the heart of a home to be. It was not cozy. It was not intimate. It was, in the houses of the prosperous, a formal reception space with a high ceiling open to the sky through a rectangular aperture, the compluvium, that let in light, and when it rained, let rain fall into the shallow pool below, the impluvium, and drain from there into the cistern beneath the floor. The atrium was furnished with the status objects of Roman domestic life: a lararium, the household shrine, usually a painted niche in the wall showing the lares, the protective spirits of the household, flanked by a serpent and perhaps a strongbox, a wooden chest bound in iron called an arca, which sat conspicuously in the atrium and held the family's valuables. The strongbox was bolted to the floor. Displaying it in the most public room of the house was deliberate. It advertised wealth. You didn't hide your prosperity in Pompeii. You put it on view. Behind the atrium, in the larger houses, lay the tablinum, a formal reception room open to the atrium where the paterfamilias, the head of the household, would sit and conduct business in a space visible from the entrance. Beyond that, the triclinium, the formal dining room, and then the peristyle, a garden surrounded by a colonnade, which in the grandest houses was planted with hedged flower beds, fountains, and statuary, and which in more modest houses was simply a small open area behind the main rooms with a garden and perhaps a kitchen garden and a well. The house was organized on an axis from the street, through the fosses, through the atrium, through the tablinum to the garden, and this axis was deliberate. When the doors were open, which they were during business hours, a visitor standing in the street could look straight through the whole depth of the house to the garden beyond. The view was a status symbol. This inward orientation is one of the first things about Pompeian life that feels alien to modern sensibilities. The city's domestic architecture was not designed to engage with the street. It was designed to enclose a private world, or as private a world as was possible in a society where the domestic and the commercial were almost inseparably blended, and where the open atrium at the center of the house was a deliberate theater of social display rather than a sanctuary of retreat. Before we go through your door, let us consider the street outside. The streets of Pompeii were paved, and this is remarkable. Not many cities in the ancient world had fully paved streets, and even in Rome itself, the paving was inconsistent beyond the major routes. In Pompeii, the main arteries, the Via dell'Abbondanza, the Via Stabiana, the Via di Nola, were paved in great irregular polygons of gray basalt lava, worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic and cartwheels, and still visible today in extraordinary condition. The pavement was slightly crowned in the center to allow rainwater to run toward the edges, where it drained into a surprisingly sophisticated system of gutters and underground channels. This is where the first thing that would kill you comes in. The streets smelled extraordinary, and not in a good way. Pompeii had no sewer system in the modern sense, or rather, it had the beginnings of one, a network of underground drains that handled rainwater runoff and some waste from the public fountains and baths, but the vast majority of domestic waste was handled in ways that would be familiar to any medieval city dweller and utterly horrifying to anyone accustomed to modern plumbing. Cesspits were dug beneath the floors of houses and businesses, lined with stone or brick, and pumped out periodically by workers called fosseres, pit diggers, who were among the lowest status and most essential workers in the city. The contents of these cesspits went somewhere, and that somewhere was generally the agricultural land outside the city walls, where it served as fertilizer. This is known because archaeologists have found traces of human pathogens in the soil of those agricultural plots, a grim but illuminating confirmation of what the written sources suggest. But the cesspits were not the only source of waste. On the streets, people threw garbage out of windows. They threw food scraps, broken pottery, dead animals, and human waste out of windows, with an approach to the concept of someone else's problem that would make a modern city councilor weep. The city did have a system of waste collection. Inscriptions from Pompeii mention contracts for street cleaning, but the cleaning was neither comprehensive nor frequent enough to keep pace with the output of a town of up to 20,000 people. The stepping stones that cross the roads at intersections, those handsome raised blocks of basalt that you've seen in photographs, stepping stones that allowed pedestrians to cross without stepping in the muck of the roadway, were there because the muck of the roadway was real, significant, and present on most days. The gaps between the stepping stones were calibrated to allow cartwheels to pass, which means that the carts that brought goods in and out of the city were themselves splashing through the same liquid accumulation that the stepping stones were designed to help you avoid. You would smell this city before you saw it. The sharp tang of garum, that ubiquitous fermented fish sauce, the ketchup of the Roman world, produced in large quantities in Pompeii, would come first, a richly pungent fermented odor that historians of ancient food describe as somewhere between very good anchovies and something you would not want to stand next to. Then the wood smoke from the dozens of bakeries and thermopolia, the hot food counter restaurants of the city, whose fires burned from before dawn. Then the animal smell of the working animals, horses, donkeys, oxen, pigs, the chickens that lived in courtyards and wandered into the street. Then the fullers' shops, the laundries, which processed wool and cleaned garments using large vats of human urine, collected from pots left outside the shop door for passers-by to contribute to. Urine was a commodity. It was collected, stored, and used because the ammonia it contained was effective at cleaning and processing wool fibers. If you walked past a fuller's shop on a warm August morning in Pompeii, you knew it. The streets themselves were narrow. Many of Pompeii's side streets were barely wide enough for two people to pass abreast without turning sideways. The main thoroughfares were wider, 6 or 8 meters in some cases, but even these felt enclosed by the continuous facades of buildings that rose 2, sometimes 3 stories on either side, cutting off the sun in the morning and creating pools of shade in the afternoon. At ground level, those facades were interrupted by the open fronts of shops, tabernae, whose hinged wooden shutters folded back during business hours to expose the full interior of the workshop or sales room to the street. Pompeii's commercial life happened almost entirely in this zone: the street, the shop front, the passing foot traffic. You bought your bread from a baker whose oven opened directly onto the footpath. You bought your wine from a jug sitting on a stone counter with holes cut for the amphoras, right there on the street. You bought your garum, your olives, your dried figs, your cheese, your dried lentils from a series of stalls and open-fronted shops that lined every main street of the city. The traffic in those streets was on a weekday morning considerable. Roman law prohibited wheeled vehicles in the city during daylight hours, a rule that appears in several cities and that existed precisely because the streets were too narrow and too crowded to accommodate carts moving freely when pedestrians were out in force. Carts came in and out of the city at night, which is why the wheel ruts in the basalt pavement are deep, cut over centuries of night traffic, and why the stepping stones at intersections show deep grooves where iron wheel rims wore them down in passing. During the day, the streets belonged to people on foot, and those people were loud. Roman cities were famously noisy. This is a point the Roman writers made themselves, with some exasperation. The poet Martial complained about the noise of Rome keeping him awake, and the satirist Juvenal described the crash of carts, the shouting of drovers, and the banging of metal workers as intolerable. Pompeii was smaller than Rome, but the same basic density of life in a small space applied. People argued, haggled, called out to friends across the street, called out to strangers to advertise their goods. Dogs barked, children ran, smiths hammered, bakers shouted orders to their assistants. The city was alive with sound. If you were a modern person dropped into this street, the sensory overload would be significant. The smell alone would be a real challenge. But let us take you inside now, where a different set of problems awaits. You wake in the dark. This is not metaphorical. Your bedroom, your cubiculum, has no window, or a window so small and set so high in the wall that it provides almost no usable light. The room is small, perhaps 3 by 4 meters, with a bed that is either a wooden frame strung with rope or leather straps and topped with a mattress stuffed with wool or straw, or, in more modest circumstances, a simple wooden platform raised slightly off the floor. You do not have a clock. You do not have an alarm. You have the light or the absence of it, and perhaps the sound of the city beginning to stir. In the summer, an August in Campania is warm, often hot, the Tyrrhenian Sea nearby making the air humid rather than dry. You may not have slept under much more than a linen sheet. In winter, which comes more mildly here than in northern Italy, but with a real chill at night, you might have several woolen blankets, a stuffed pillow, and possibly a brazier, a small bronze or iron pan on legs, filled with burning charcoal, in the corner of the room. That brazier is genuinely pleasant on a cold January night, and genuinely dangerous because the room has no ventilation to speak of, and carbon monoxide from a charcoal fire in a small enclosed space is a silent killer. Deaths from brazier fumes are documented in Roman literature. People went to sleep warm and did not wake up. It happened. You rise and dress. There is no closet because there is no concept of closet storage. Your clothes are folded in a wooden chest, and they are fewer than you might expect. The basic garment for a free Roman man is the tunica, a simple T-shaped garment of wool or linen reaching to the knee, belted at the waist. If you're going out, you might add a toga, but probably not, because the toga, that heavy, unwieldy, several meters long length of semicircular wool that has to be draped and arranged with considerable skill and assistance, was formal dress, and most Romans in everyday life wore it only when required. For a working day in the city, the tunica and perhaps a cloak, the lacerna, were sufficient. A woman wore a longer tunica, the stola, belted above and below the waist, and over it, when going out, a large shawl, the palla, that could be drawn over the head. Footwear was sandals, the caliga for outdoor use, a sturdy sandal with a thick leather sole, and straps that wrapped around the foot and sometimes partway up the ankle. Going barefoot inside the house was normal. Going barefoot outside was not unusual for children, for the poor, and for enslaved people. You have not bathed this morning? You will bathe this afternoon at the public baths, as you do most days. In the morning, a quick wash of face and hands in a basin of water from the cistern below your atrium. There is no soap. Soap, in the modern sense, did not exist in the Roman world, or rather, it existed in crude forms, but was not used for personal washing. Romans cleaned themselves at the baths using olive oil and a curved metal scraper called a strigil. You applied oil to your skin, perhaps mixed with fine sand or pumice, and then scraped it off, taking the dirt with it. This is not a significantly less effective method of cleaning than soap and water, but it is very different, and the absence of your morning shower is one of the first small adjustments that would be required of you as a visitor. Men who could afford it, and some who could not, visited a tonsure, a barber regularly. Barber shops were common fixtures on Pompeian streets, identifiable in some cases by their equipment found in situ: the iron razors, the bronze mirrors, the small tables. The Roman barber was, like the barber of later centuries, also a conversationalist, a gossip, and a source of neighborhood news. Pliny the Elder complained that the barber's shop was where the most dangerous and unreliable information in the city circulated. Sitting in a barber shop was, in other words, one of the primary ways that news moved through the city, alongside the thermopolium counter and the bath changing room. If you wanted to know what was happening in Pompeii, who was running for Adel, whose business had just failed, who had been seen where with whom, you went to the barber and you listened. What you eat for breakfast is minimal. The Roman morning meal, the ientaculum, was not the elaborate affair that our culture tends to make of breakfast. It was bread, possibly bread with olive oil, or bread with a little garum or honey or dried fruit, possibly a handful of olives, possibly some hard cheese, possibly nothing at all, with the first real food of the day being consumed at midday. There is no coffee, there is no tea, in the sense of a hot beverage made from the Camellia sinensis plant, which does not exist in the Roman world. There is water, and there is wine, often heavily diluted with water, in a ratio that varied from 3 parts water to 1 of wine on up to more equal proportions, depending on the time of day, the occasion, and the personal habits of the drinker. If you are in the habit of starting your day with caffeine, the absence of it in first century Pompeii will be felt acutely and immediately, and there is nothing you can do about it. Before you step out the door, let's talk about water, because water in Pompeii is a subject of considerable sophistication, genuine achievement, and a few serious public health hazards that you would encounter before the end of your first day. Pompeii's water supply was transformed in the first century BCE and the early years of the first century CE by the construction of the Aqua Augusta, the great aqueduct built under the Emperor Augustus that brought water from springs in the Apennine Mountains 70 kilometers away, following the contours of the hills, crossing valleys on arcaded stone bridges, arriving in Campania at a distribution center at Misenum near the Bay of Naples, and then branching to serve 9 cities and settlements in the region, including Pompeii. The water entered the city from the north, arriving at a large Castellum Aquae, a water distribution tower, the remains of which you can still see near the Vesuvius Gate, and then flowing through a system of lead pipes to public fountains throughout the city, to the public baths, to the large private houses of the wealthy, and to a number of businesses that needed a continuous water supply. There were at least 40 public fountains distributed throughout Pompeii at the time of the eruption. Recent surveys have identified more, placed at regular intervals throughout the city, so that no resident was more than about 80 meters from a public water source. This was a genuinely remarkable provision, and Pompeii was better supplied with public water than many European cities of the 18th century. The fountains ran continuously, the water flowing in and out in a constant stream, which meant that the basins remained relatively fresh and the excess drained away into the sewer system. The carved stone heads that often decorated these fountains, a lion, a satyr, an emperor, served both as ornamentation and as a visual marker for the illiterate, identifying the fountain and often indicating which branch of the distribution system it was connected to. Here is the problem: the pipes were lead, all of them. The secondary distribution pipes that ran under the streets from the castellum to the fountains, the service pipes that ran from the street mains into private houses, the fittings, the connectors, all of lead. Lead was the Roman plumbing material of choice because it was malleable, easy to cast and solder, resistant to corrosion, and relatively cheap. The word plumbing itself comes from the Latin plumbum, meaning lead, and lead, of course, is a neurotoxin. The debate among historians and scientists about lead poisoning in the Roman world is long running and not fully resolved. Some argue that the continuous flow of water through the pipes, the short transit time, and the coating of calcium carbonate that built up on the interior of the pipes over time would have reduced lead leaching to relatively low levels. Others argue that even low-level chronic lead exposure across a lifetime of drinking from lead-lined cups and lead-piped water systems would have contributed to the documented patterns of impulsive behavior, cognitive decline, and reproductive problems that appear in Roman medical and historical literature. The Romans did not know about lead poisoning. They knew that drinking water that tasted sweet was good, not understanding that the sweetness was sometimes the result of lead salts dissolving into slightly acidic water. They would not have known to worry about it. You, armed with modern knowledge, would worry a great deal. In addition to lead pipes, there was the issue of what the water shared its network with. The underground sewers of Pompeii, where they existed, ran beneath the streets, and they ran near the water pipes. The construction was good, but it was not perfect, and in places where joints had cracked or connections had shifted, the possibility of contamination between the sewer flow and the water supply was real. This is not a hypothetical. It is the mechanism by which cholera spreads in any city without modern water treatment, and the Roman world had endemic diarrheal diseases that killed substantial numbers of people, especially children and the elderly, in every city every summer. You fill your clay pitcher at the nearest street fountain. The water is cool, clear, and tastes of minerals. You do not think about the pipes. You carry the water home and you begin your day. Pompeii's Forum was the center of the city's public life in the same way that a town square is the center of a European market town, but more so. It was the city's political, commercial, judicial, and religious heart all in one. A large, roughly rectangular, open space paved in travertine, flanked on its long sides and south end by colonnaded porticos, its short north end closed by the imposing Capitolium, the temple of the Capitoline Triad, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, standing on a high podium that dominated the whole space. The Forum was closed to wheeled traffic. Large stone blocks at the entrances of the streets that led to it made this impossible, so that the Forum itself, unlike the surrounding streets, was a space of relative quiet and deliberate ceremony. You went to the Forum for many reasons. You went to attend to legal business. The building on the Forum's east side, the Basilica, was Pompeii's courthouse and commercial court, where contracts were witnessed, disputes adjudicated, and debts pursued through the legal system. You went to make offerings at the temples, the Capitolium, the Temple of Apollo with its bronze Apollo and its ancient sundial, the Temple of Vespasian, and the Temple of the Lares Publici, which were added in the years following the devastating earthquake of 62 CE that had damaged much of the city. You went to the market buildings, the Macellum, the city's main food market, where under a central domed structure fish and meat were sold from a ring of counters, and around the porticos dried goods, pottery, and sundries were available from stalls. And you went to the forum simply because everyone else did, because it was where the city's social life happened, where you ran into people you knew, where you conducted the informal commerce of relationship and reputation that was as essential to business in the Roman world as anywhere else. The economic world of Pompeii was a complex one. The city was not primarily an agricultural community, though agricultural land was essential to the city's wealth. The volcanic soils of the region were extraordinarily fertile, producing wine grapes, olives, grain, and market vegetables of exceptional quality, and the large landowners of the region, who might live in a Pompeian townhouse for part of the year and on a country estate for the rest, drew most of their income from agricultural production on those estates. But the city itself was commercial. It was a port town, or a near port town, the actual harbor being a little way down the Sarno River, and it processed and traded the agricultural products of the region. It processed wool into cloth. It made pottery, some of it exported as far as Gaul and North Africa. It made garum, fish sauce, in such quantities that Pompeian garum became a recognized brand in the Roman world, with amphoras stamped with the names of Pompeian producers found at sites across the empire. The making of garum was one of the more extreme examples of the city's relationship with its own smell. To make garum, you took fish or fish parts, especially the intestines, livers, and other offal, and you layered them with salt in large stone or terracotta containers in roughly equal parts by weight. You left this mixture to ferment in the open air for weeks or months, stirring it periodically. The fermentation was microbial, bacteria breaking down the fish proteins into a rich, deeply savory, intensely pungent liquid. That liquid, strained and bottled, was garum. It was also, during its production, one of the most aggressively unpleasant smells you could be in proximity to, which is why the evidence suggests that the main garum production facilities in Pompeii were located near the city's edges, close to the sea, where the prevailing breezes could carry the smell away from the densest residential areas, or at least try to. Walking the forum, you would conduct your business, exchange news, make observations about the electoral notices that covered every available wall surface with the names of candidates for the city's two most important annual offices, the duoviri, the pair of magistrates who effectively ran the city, and the recommendations of their various supporters. These electoral notices are one of the most charming things Pompeii has left us. Dozens of whitewashed walls covered in red or black painted endorsements, some formal, some completely unexpected. The fruit sellers unanimously urge the election of Marcus Holconius Priscus. His neighbors urge the election of Gaius Julius Polybius as aedile, Vatia for aedile. All the late-night drinkers ask for this. All the sneak thieves support Vatia. That last one is, probably, not a sincere endorsement. Probably. The forum was also where you might watch the periodic public spectacles that punctuated the Roman civic calendar, religious processions, the occasional public sacrifice at one of the temples, the arrival of important visitors, and in some cases public punishments. Justice in the Roman world was administered with a physicality that modern sensibilities would find difficult to witness. Flogging, branding, crucifixion, these were public events, conducted in public spaces, visible to anyone who happened to be in the vicinity, and intended to be visible because the deterrent value of public punishment depended on it being seen. This is one of the ways in which the fabric of daily life in Pompeii included a degree of casual violence that modern life has, in most settings, removed from public sight, and whose absence we tend not to notice until it is made present. To walk through a day in Pompeii without understanding the social structure that organized every human interaction you would have is to miss most of what was actually happening. The Roman social world was one of the most elaborately stratified and formally organized hierarchies in the ancient world, and Pompeii's society reflected that hierarchy at every level. At the top, locally, were the decurions, the members of the city council, the Ordo Decurionum, who had to meet a property qualification to hold their seats and who, as a class, dominated the city's political life. Below them, in the free population, were the plebeians, free citizens of varying economic levels, from the prosperous merchant to the day laborer. Below them, in legal status, if not always in practical economic terms, were the freedmen and freedwomen, people who had been enslaved and had been formally manumitted, granted their freedom, but who remained bound to their former owners by the institution of patronage. And at the bottom of the legal hierarchy, not counted as persons in the full legal sense, but as property, were the enslaved. Slavery in Pompeii was not the same as the chattel slavery of the American antebellum South, though the comparison is sometimes made, and it was not significantly more humane for that distinction. Roman slavery was a condition that could befall anyone: prisoners of war, children of enslaved women, people kidnapped by pirates or slave traders, people who had sold themselves into slavery to pay debts, and it was not organized along racial lines in the way that American slavery was. It was organized along the lines of power and ownership, and those lines were absolute. An enslaved person in Roman law was property. They could be bought, sold, hired out, separated from their families, beaten, sexually exploited, and killed, with certain legal restrictions that varied over time and that were in practice frequently ignored by their owners. In Pompeii, enslaved people were everywhere. They worked in the bakeries, grinding grain and tending the ovens. They worked in the workshops. They served at the tables of the wealthy. They staffed the brothels. They educated the children of wealthy households, because educated Greek enslaved men were particularly valued as tutors. They managed the accounts of business owning households. They carried litters. They ran messages. In the largest household of the city, the house of the Veti, the house of Menander, the house of the Faun, the domestic enslaved population might number 20 or 30 individuals, sleeping in small rooms off the corridors and courtyards, constantly available, constantly on call. The casts of the dead found at Pompeii include enslaved people. Among the most famous groups found in a single location, a set of bodies discovered in the villa at Oplontis nearby. Analysis of the skeletal remains suggests a mixed group of free and enslaved individuals, identifiable by the wear patterns on their bones, the items found with them, and the presence of iron ankle chains on some of the skeletons. Even in death, even in the absolute democracy of a pyroclastic surge that killed everyone without preference for status or wealth, the physical markers of their condition remained. The chains were still on their legs. They could not run. The institution of manumission, the formal freeing of enslaved persons, was a feature of Roman slavery that distinguished it structurally from later American chattel slavery, where manumission was rare and actively discouraged by law. In Rome, a slave owner could free an enslaved person through a formal legal ceremony, and the freed person became a libertas or libertus, a freedman or freedwoman, and a Roman citizen, though with certain legal disabilities relative to the freeborn. The children of freed persons were freeborn Romans with full rights. This created a pathway out of slavery that, while not universal and not guaranteed, meant that the Roman population included a substantial number of people who had been enslaved or were the children of formerly enslaved people and who were now legally citizens. This produced some of the most interesting social configurations in Pompeian life. Freed persons who were economically talented, and the Roman practice of allowing educated, skilled enslaved people to operate small businesses and earn money toward their own purchase price meant that some freed persons arrived at freedom with money, skills, and business connections, could accumulate considerable wealth. The two most famous residents of the House of the Vedi in Pompeii, Aulus Vedius Restitutus and Aulus Vedius Conviva, were almost certainly freed persons who had built a substantial commercial fortune. Their house is one of the most lavishly decorated in the city, with elaborate painted rooms, a beautiful garden with marble fountains and bronze statues, and walls covered in mythological and erotic paintings of extraordinary quality. They had money. They displayed it with an enthusiasm that the old money of the traditional elite sometimes found a little much. The social tensions between new wealth and old blood are perennial, and Pompeii was no exception. The institution of patronage, the system by which free people of lower status attached themselves to powerful patrons who provided protection, legal assistance, business connections, and sometimes cash in exchange for political support, social prestige, and a variety of services, was the connective tissue of Roman social life. If you were a free person of middling status in Pompeii, you probably had a patron and you probably had clients. The formal morning salutatio, the greeting visit paid by clients to their patron's house each morning at dawn, was an institution that shaped the entire organization of the Roman day, including the layout of houses, which were designed with the atrium as a reception space precisely for this daily ritual of social obligation. You would navigate this world by instinct and training if you had been born into it. Arriving as a modern person without it, you would commit an endless series of social errors. You would fail to address people by the correct honorific. You would fail to recognize the social signals embedded in dress, in manner, in the choice of where to sit in a public space. You would fail to understand why the man you just spoke to as an equal treated you with freezing contempt, because he was, in fact, of considerably higher status than you, and your failure to recognize that was an insult. You would fail to understand why the woman selling bread at the counter is not making eye contact with you, because in certain contexts, certain kinds of direct eye contact between a woman and a man unknown to her were socially charged in ways that do not have a modern equivalent. The social performance of daily life in Pompeii was dense, codified, and unforgiving of mistakes. You would get most of it wrong, and some of those mistakes would have consequences. It is approaching midday, and you are hungry. Let us go to a thermopolium. A thermopolium was, in the simplest terms, a hot food counter, the Roman equivalent of a street food stall or a fast food window, though the range of what was available was broader, and the communal aspect of eating there was more developed than the term fast food implies. Pompeii had an extraordinary number of thermopolia. Archaeological surveys of the city have identified over 80, which for a city of 20,000 people represents one food counter for roughly every 250 people. Compare this to the number of restaurants per capita in a modern European city of comparable size, and you get a sense of just how central eating outside the home was to Pompeian daily life. The reason for this was, in part, the architecture. A significant portion of Pompeii's population did not live in domus with a fully equipped kitchen. They lived in upper floor apartments or in small rooms attached to workshops or in the back rooms of other people's houses, and these spaces often had no cooking facilities at all. Cooking fires in a crowded city of wooden furniture, linen hangings, and tightly packed buildings were a serious fire risk, and the city's history included multiple devastating fires over its centuries of existence. For many urban Romans, eating out or buying prepared food to take home was not a choice driven by laziness, but a structural feature of urban life. The thermopolium's typical setup was a masonry counter, L-shaped or straight, with circular holes cut into its top surface. Into these holes were fitted large pottery amphoras or dolii, storage vessels containing the day's food, stews, cooked legumes, wine, water, perhaps garum sauce for dressing other dishes. You stood or sat at the counter and indicated what you wanted. The food was ladled out or served on a ceramic plate or in a small bowl. Bread, always bread, came alongside. Wine was diluted with water and served in cups. Recent and extraordinary excavations at a thermopolium called the Thermopolium of Reggio 5, uncovered in a dig that made international news in 2020 and 2021, gave us an unprecedented close-up view of what was on the menu on the day of the eruption. The food containers were found still in place, their contents partially preserved under the volcanic material, and analysis of those contents revealed a remarkable menu: duck, pig, goat, fish, snail, beef, and what appears to have been a kind of paella-like dish made from various meats combined with legumes. Fragments of horse bone were present, suggesting that horse meat was on offer or had been recently, a food source that the Romans used more readily than we do today. The walls of this particular thermopolium were painted with images of the very dishes being served, a kind of illustrated menu that also functioned as decoration. One image showed a rooster, another showed two ducks hanging by their necks. These were not decorative choices, they were advertisements. You eat standing at the counter, or perhaps on a low wooden bench along the wall if the thermopolium has one. The food is hot and genuinely good. Campanian cuisine in the 1st century CE was, by the standards of the ancient world, luxurious and sophisticated. The region produced exceptional wine. Pompeian wine had its own reputation, and the grapes from the slopes of the very mountain that would destroy the city produced a well regarded product. The region produced olives and olive oil of high quality, fish from a productive sea, vegetables from extraordinarily fertile soil, and a livestock tradition that made for very good pork, lamb, and goat. One thing worth pausing on is the seasoning, because the way that Romans tasted food is genuinely different from modern European expectations and would have required some adjustment. Garum, the fish sauce, was to Roman cuisine what salt is to modern cooking, but with a complexity and depth of flavor that also resembles good soy sauce or Worcestershire sauce. It went on almost everything. But alongside garum, Roman cooking used a combination of flavors that modern Western palates often find unexpected: sweet and savory combined constantly, with honey mixed into sauces for meat, dried fruit added to stews, and wine reduction used as a sweet condiment in ways that read more like Middle Eastern or Southeast Asian cooking than like modern Italian food. The Romans loved this combination of fish fermented salt, sweetness, acidity from vinegar, and herbal bitterness in ways that don't have a single modern culinary tradition as a close parallel. They also used a spice called laser or silphium, a plant, probably a species of giant fennel, that was so heavily harvested from its native range in North Africa that it was driven to extinction before the end of the classical period. The last recorded stalk was reportedly presented to the Emperor Nero. What it tasted like exactly cannot be known with certainty, though it is described as something between asafoetida and garlic. Its disappearance is one of the stranger culinary losses of antiquity. You pay with small bronze coins, the asses and semices of daily commerce, and step back into the street. In the afternoon, before the day's business is entirely concluded, you go to the baths. The public baths, the thermae and balneae of Pompeii, were among the most important institutions of daily life. Pompeii had at least three large bath complexes operating at the time of the eruption: the Stabian Baths, the Forum Baths, and the Central Baths, the last still under construction when the volcano struck, along with a number of smaller private bath establishments. Bathing was not a weekly or monthly activity in the Roman world. It was a daily one for those who could afford the entry fee, which was minimal, a quadrans, the smallest denomination of Roman currency, the equivalent of less than half an aes, affordable to almost everyone, and for those who had the time. The Roman bath was not simply a place to get clean. It was a social institution, a leisure facility, a place of exercise, conversation, commercial networking, and in some establishments, a great deal of activity that took place in the attached rooms that were technically separate from the main bath complex but were functionally adjacent to it. The Romans understood perfectly well that baths and prostitution tended to co-locate, and their literature is full of both the humor and the moral concern this generated. Let's walk through the experience. You arrive at the bath complex, let's say the Stabian Baths, the oldest and largest in the city, located near the intersection of the Via Stabiana and the Via dell'Abbondanza. You pay your quadrans at the entrance. You strip in the apoditerium, the changing room, where your clothes go into a small niche in the wall, watched over by a slave if you have one with you, or simply left unattended if you don't, which means there's a reasonable chance they won't be there when you get back, because theft in the changing rooms of Roman baths was a source of constant complaint in Latin literature. Martial again, juvenile again. The theft of sandals and tunics from bath changing rooms was apparently so common as to be one of the defining irritations of urban life. You begin in the tepidarium, the warm room where you allow your body to acclimatize. The tepidarium is heated by a hypocaust system, the Roman underfloor heating technology, in which hot air from a furnace outside the building circulates through channels beneath a raised floor and up through hollow walls, heating both the floor and the walls and keeping the room at a comfortable temperature. Walking on a hypocaust heated floor is one of the genuinely pleasant experiences available in the ancient world. Warm underfoot, warm on all sides, the air softly heated. The Stabian Baths' tepidarium has stucco decoration on the walls, little terracotta figures projecting from the niches between the pilasters, painted panels now faded but once vivid. From the tepidarium, you move to the caldarium, the hot room, where the temperature is considerably higher and where one of the basins of cold water available allows you to splash yourself if the heat becomes too much. In the caldarium, you apply oil from a small flask you carry with you, or from oil provided at the baths for a small additional charge, to your skin, work it in, and scrape it off with your strigil. You do this several times. This is the Roman equivalent of washing. The oil picks up the dirt and the old skin cells, and the strigil removes it. What you are left with is skin that is actually quite clean, moisturized from the oil, and smelling somewhat better than when you arrived. The collective strigil scrapings from the bath, the oil and dead skin, were apparently collected and sold as a medicine. Galen recommends it. We will not dwell on this. After the caldarium, you move to the frigidarium for a cold plunge, a brief immersion in cold water that Romans believed was bracing and healthful. Then back to the changing room, redress, and emerge into the afternoon street, feeling genuinely better than when you went in. The social side of the baths was real and important. You talked, you gossiped, you met people, business contacts, neighbors, the sorts of loose acquaintances that urban life generates and that served in the pre-social media world as the main distribution mechanism for news, rumor, opinion, and commercial information. The baths were genuinely democratic spaces. Men of different social levels bathed together, though at different times and in different sections if the establishment was large enough to have sex-segregated facilities. Most Pompeian baths had separate sections for men and women. Smaller establishments had different hours for each sex. An enslaved person who had been granted permission to use the baths would share the tepidarium with a free citizen. One thing you would not have, leaving the baths, is a towel in the modern sense. You would be handed a coarse linen cloth to pat yourself dry, but this was not really the elaborate, fluffy towel experience of modern life. The Romans left the baths somewhat damp and air-dried. In Campanian summer heat, this was fine. In November, it was brisk. You have been in Pompeii for half a day. You have drunk water from lead pipes. You have walked through streets contaminated with fecal matter and industrial runoff. You have eaten food prepared in conditions that no modern health inspector would pass. You have breathed air thick with smoke, animal waste, sulfurous volcanic emissions from the ground beneath the city. Pompeii sat in a geologically active area and there were visible signs of this in the form of small tremors, occasional gas vents, and the generally elevated temperature of the volcanic soil and the chemical fumes from the fuller's shops and the garum factories. If you had any predisposition to respiratory problems, these would be exacerbated. Now, let us say, for the sake of this chapter, that you become ill. What happens? If you had money, you went to a medicus, a physician. Pompeii had physicians. We know this because surgical instruments have been found in the city, quite sophisticated ones, including specula, bone saws, forceps, probes, and various specialized tools whose functions are identifiable from comparison with Greek and Roman medical texts. The city had at least one documented female physician. A woman named Maya is referenced in a wall inscription as a medica, a female doctor, which is notable given how restricted women's professional lives generally were in the Roman world. The theoretical framework within which these physicians operated was the Hippocratic Galenic humoral system. The theory of the four humors blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, whose balance or imbalance explained the state of health or disease. In practice, this meant that the physician's therapeutic arsenal included bloodletting, purging with emetic or laxative drugs, dietary modification, rest, baths of various temperatures, poultices, herbal preparations, and occasionally surgery. Some of these interventions had real efficacy. Willow bark, used in various preparations, contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, and had genuine analgesic and fever reducing effects. Opium was known and used. Poppy derived drugs appear in the pharmacopoeia of Roman physicians, and the evidence for their use in Pompeii includes morphine traces found in some archaeological contexts. Honey was used as a wound dressing, and its antimicrobial properties are real. The surgical instruments found in Pompeii suggest that Roman surgeons performed procedures, the removal of cataracts, the treatment of fistulae, the repair of hernias, that required both skill and a reasonable understanding of anatomy. But a great deal of Roman medicine was ineffective or actively harmful. Bloodletting, which remained a mainstay of Western medicine until the 19th century, was available to the Roman physician and used regularly. Purging with aggressive emetics damaged the stomach and esophagus. Many of the mineral compounds used in Roman pharmacy, including preparations containing lead, arsenic, and mercury, were toxic. The concept of infection control did not exist. The idea that diseases could be transmitted by invisible entities, what we would call germs, was present in very primitive form in a few Roman writers. Marcus Terentius Varro speculated in the 1st century BCE about tiny invisible creatures, Animalia minuta, that might cause disease in a passage that reads like an uncanny anticipation of germ theory, but had not become part of mainstream medical practice. Surgical wounds became infected. Childbed fever killed women after apparently successful deliveries. Intestinal parasites, present in the city's population as documented by analysis of the city's sewage deposits, caused chronic illness and malnutrition. If you became ill in Pompeii and could not afford a physician, you relied on the home remedies of your family or neighbors, the local shrines to healing deities, the Asclepia, dedicated to the god of medicine, and his daughter Hygeia, the goddess of health, and the preparations sold by apothecaries and herb sellers in the city's markets. Some of these were genuinely useful, many were placebos. The situation was not significantly different in practical outcome from much of what a physician offered. The Romans also had a relationship with illness that was inseparable from religion. Illness was often understood as the displeasure of a deity, not necessarily moral displeasure, not necessarily the result of something you had done wrong, but a disturbance in the relationship between the human world and the divine one. The appropriate response included sacrifice, prayer, the wearing of protective amulets, and consultation of oracles and dream interpreters, alongside whatever the physician prescribed. These were not considered alternatives to medicine, they were considered complementary to it. A sensible person did both. Walking through Pompeii, you could not have avoided the gods. They were everywhere. The city had major public temples, the Capitolium dominating the Forum, the Temple of Apollo with its ancient Greek origins and its beautiful bronze statues, the Temple of Isis that stood near the large theater and whose fully restored state at the time of the eruption. It had been rebuilt after the earthquake of 62 CEE by a wealthy freedman named Numerius Papidius Ampliatus, acting through his young son to gain social credit, suggests the considerable wealth and devotion of the goddess's Pompeian cult. They had shrines at street corners, the Lararia, small painted niches in the walls of the city's streets and doorways, showing the Lares and the genius, the household gods, and the spirit of the paterfamilias, accompanied by a serpent in many depictions, the serpent being a symbol of protective power and the spirit of the house. They had household shrines inside every home, large or small. They had paintings of deities in public buildings, in private houses, in workshops and bakeries. The religious life of Pompeii was not contained in temples, it was woven into the walls. The official state religion, the worship of the Capitoline Triad, the maintenance of the public temples, the performance of public sacrifices on the major feast days of the Roman calendar, was conducted by a priestly class that was not professional in the sense of being dedicated exclusively to religion. In Roman practice, priesthoods were civic offices held on a rotational or electoral basis by members of the elite who also held political offices and conducted business. The pontifex, the augur, the flamen, these were roles taken on alongside other civic responsibilities. This is one of the ways in which Roman religion feels most alien to modern sensibilities shaped by the separation of religious and secular life. In Pompeii, they were the same thing. A sacrifice at the Capitolium before a major legal proceeding was not a religious intrusion into a secular process. It was simply part of the process. Alongside the official religion, Pompeii had a remarkably diverse religious life that reflected the city's connections to the wider Mediterranean world. The cult of Isis, originally Egyptian, had spread through the Roman world with considerable success, offering its adherents a deep personal relationship with the goddess, elaborate initiation rituals, and the promise of divine protection, and in some interpretations, life after death. The inscription that records the rebuilding of the Temple of Isis after the earthquake, which gave the child Numerius Papidius Celsinus, then only 6 years old, membership of the city council as a reward for his father's generosity, is a remarkable document of how public religion, private wealth, and social ambition interacted in Pompeii's civic life. There were also Jewish residents of Pompeii, their presence attested by a few graffiti inscriptions, and possibly early Christians, though the evidence for the latter is thin and disputed. The famous graffito from the basilica, Sodoma Gomorrah, has sometimes been cited as evidence of Christian presence, but its interpretation is contested. The multiple gods of the Roman world were not jealous of one another, with a few notable exceptions. Adopting a new deity did not require you to abandon the others. A Pompeian household might have a shrine to the Lares, make regular offerings at the temple of Apollo, participate in the mysteries of Isis, and also hang an amulet of the Egyptian god Bes, a dwarf deity associated with protection of mothers and children, whose image was common in Pompeii, in the bedroom as protection for the newborn. These were not contradictions. They were a comprehensive approach to a world full of powers that could help or harm you, and the appropriate strategy was to cultivate as many good relationships with as many of those powers as possible. Pompeii had two theaters, one large, one small, and then it had the amphitheater, which is a different thing entirely. The large theater, the Teatro Grandes, was carved into the slope of a lava flow to the south of the city, using the natural hillside to support its tiered seating in the Greek style, and held an audience of somewhere between 5 and 10,000 people. It was open to the sky, shaded by a velarium, a system of awnings, in hot weather, and it hosted a range of performances throughout the year tied to the religious festivals of the Roman calendar. The Ludi Scenici, the theatrical games, included tragedies, comedies, mimes, and pantomimes. The mimes and pantomimes were the most popular, featuring performers in elaborate costumes and masks, with solo dancers telling complex mythological narratives through movement alone, accompanied by music and a narrator. The pantomime dancer was the closest thing to a modern celebrity that the Roman world produced, and successful performers attracted devoted, sometimes dangerously devoted, fan followings. The smaller Odeon, or covered theater, was more intimate, used for musical performances, recitations, and public debates. It held about 1,500 people under a permanent roof, which made it unusual in the Roman world. Its seating was covered in marble, and the decoration was elaborate. Then there was the amphitheater. Pompeii's amphitheater is the oldest surviving stone amphitheater in the Roman world, built around 70 BCE, 3 decades before the Colosseum was even dreamed of. It held somewhere between 12 and 20,000 spectators, potentially more than the city's entire population, which means that it drew visitors from the surrounding towns and countryside. It was used for gladiatorial games. Gladiatorial combat in the Roman world is one of those subjects where the modern imagination tends to run either toward fantasy or toward sanitization, and neither is accurate. The fights were real, the injuries were real, the deaths were real, though less common than popular imagination often suggests. A trained gladiator represented a significant investment of money and time, and a good gladiator who died in every fight would be an expensive and short-lived resource. Archaeological analysis of gladiatorial remains has found multiple healed injuries alongside the fatal wounds, confirming that fighters survived for extended careers. The mortality rate per combat was probably somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 for professional fighters in a major spectacle, high, but not the absolute certainty of death that film depictions often imply. What the amphitheater experience was actually like for a spectator in Pompeii is something we can reconstruct in considerable detail. You arrived early. The games typically began in the morning and ran through the day. The seats were divided by status. The closest seats to the sand were reserved for city magistrates and the elite. The upper tiers, further from the action, were for the general public, with the very top tier, where standing room was available, being the cheapest and most crowded. Women were segregated to specific sections of the seating in some periods, though the evidence for Pompeii's specific arrangements is not entirely clear. You bought food from vendors who moved through the crowd: bread, sausages, water, wine, and you watched. Before the main gladiatorial bouts came other spectacles: animal hunts, in which animals from across the empire, bears, boars, big cats, if the games were wealthy enough to afford them, were released into the arena to be killed by specialist fighters, the venatores. Then the gladiators. The games were embedded in the political culture of the city in the same way that electoral endorsements were. The magistrate or wealthy patron who paid for the games, and they were enormously expensive, was purchasing political and social capital with every day of spectacle. The notices advertising upcoming games that appear on Pompeii's walls. 20 pairs of gladiators will fight at Pompeii on the 15th and 20th of April, and there will be animal hunts, were also implicitly advertisements for the wealth and generosity of the patron providing them. Pompeii's amphitheater was the site of a famous riot in 59 CE, described by the historian Tacitus. A fight broke out between the Pompeians and spectators who had come from the neighboring town of Nuceria, with deaths on both sides, significant injuries, and a political scandal serious enough that the Roman Senate banned gladiatorial games in Pompeii for 10 years. The image of this riot was painted on the walls of a Pompeian house, the house of Actius Anicetus, showing the amphitheater with fighters going at it, both inside and outside its walls, surrounded by the tents and awnings of the spectator crowd. It is one of the most vivid documents of crowd violence in the ancient world, and it is painted on the wall of someone's dining room, which tells you something about how this culture memorialized its public events. There is something you would notice immediately, walking through Pompeii, that does not have a direct modern equivalent. The walls talk. Every white plastered wall in the city, and that meant most walls, since plastering and whitewashing was the standard exterior treatment for buildings, was a potential surface for writing, and the people of Pompeii used this potential exhaustively. The walls of the city are covered in Latin writing of every kind. More than 11,000 graffiti and inscriptions have been cataloged from Pompeii's ruins, making it by far the richest single source of everyday Latin writing from the ancient world, and the range of what was written there is extraordinary. The most numerous are the electoral notices we mentioned earlier, the programmata, formal painted endorsements for candidates in the city's annual elections. These were painted by professional sign painters at the request of political supporters in red or black paint on freshly whitewashed sections of wall. They follow a consistent formula: the candidate's name in large letters, the office he is seeking, and his endorsers. The endorsers range from the city's most distinguished citizens to, memorably, the sneak thieves and the late night drinkers, whether these were genuine endorsements from unofficial associations or political jokes at a candidate's expense is still debated. Then there were announcements, gladiatorial games, auctions, property for rent, lost goods. A copper pot has gone missing from this shop. Whoever brings it back will receive 65 sestertii. Whoever gives information about the thief will receive a quarter of the reward. This is a missing property notice, scratched into the plaster of a wall, as direct and practical as a modern social media post about a lost cat. Then there were the personal graffiti, declarations of love, insults, boasts, poems, jokes, philosophical musings, and observations about daily life that range from the elevated to the spectacularly vulgar. Successus the weaver loves the innkeeper's slave girl named Iris. She doesn't care about him at all, but he begs her, written by his rival, Farewell. Three different handwriting styles on that one, the original author, the rival adding his commentary, and a third party commenting on the exchange. I am amazed, O wall, that you have not collapsed from having to bear the weight of so much stupid writing. This last is from a wall in the basilica, and it was written either by someone genuinely exasperated by the volume of graffiti, or by someone with a sufficiently well developed sense of irony to embed this complaint in the very medium it was complaining about. There are literary quotations. Lines from Virgil appear repeatedly, which tells us that the Aeneid had already, within decades of its publication, become the kind of widely memorized cultural touchstone that Shakespeare's plays became in English culture. There are crude sexual boasts. There are scorekeeping marks of unknown purpose. There is a drawing of a gladiator. There is a carefully rendered caricature of a face. There is a child's handwriting practice, writing the alphabet over and over. There are the names of people, just names, scratched into the plaster for no apparent reason other than the basic human desire to leave a mark, to say, I was here, in a city without newspapers, without a town notice board in any formal sense, without any mechanism for mass communication except the voice of a herald in the forum. The walls of Pompeii functioned as a collective public text, a running social media feed in the most literal possible sense, written directly onto the surfaces of urban life. To walk through the streets was to read the city. The literate absorbed the electoral notices, the announcements, the poems, the insults, the love declarations. Even the illiterate could look at the painted images, the gladiator, the theater mask, the decorated border around an advertisement, and understand something of what was being communicated. The sun begins to drop behind the ridge to the west. The shadows lengthen across the forum's travertine. The thermopolia are beginning the transition from their afternoon menu to their evening one. The bath complexes are entering their last hours of operation for the day, and if you are fortunate enough to have been invited, or prosperous enough to be hosting, the great social event of the Pompeian evening is approaching. The cena, the dinner. The Roman dinner was not what we think of when we think of dinner. It was, at its most elaborate, a performance, a ritualized social event whose organization, sequence, and symbolic content were as carefully managed as any theatrical production. This is again most true at the top of the social scale, where the great dinner parties described by Petronius in the Satyricon, a satirical novel set in a city very like Pompeii, and almost certainly drawing on real social observation, were exercises in conspicuous consumption, social maneuvering, philosophical display, and mutual appraisal that could last for hours and consume entire fortunes over the course of a season. At your level of society, the scena was simpler, but still structured. You arrived in the late afternoon. You reclined. Romans ate lying down on couches arranged around a central table, leaning on your left elbow, eating with your right hand. This is not, it turns out, the most convenient position for eating, and it required practice and a certain flexibility to manage without either falling off the couch or dropping your food. Children and people of low status might sit rather than recline. Women, in earlier periods of Roman history, almost invariably sat. By the first century CE, women of the upper classes reclined alongside men. The meal came in courses. The gustatio was the starter: eggs, olives, raw vegetables, shellfish if the host was wealthy enough, all with sauces and dressings heavily featuring, yes, garum. The prima mensa was the main course, a variety of dishes served simultaneously, including roasted meats, stews, vegetables dressed with oil and garum and vinegar, bread. Then the secunda mensa, sweet dishes, fruit, nuts, honey-soaked pastries, wine with spiced additions. The wine was mixed with water throughout the meal, poured from a large mixing vessel, the crater, by a slave who circulated among the couches. The conversation at the scena was as important as the food. A Roman host of ambition arranged the evening to include not just food and drink, but music, recitation, debate, and philosophical discussion. A good dinner was one that exercised the mind as well as the body. Guests who had nothing interesting to say were poor guests regardless of their social rank. The slaves who attended the dinner, pouring wine, bringing dishes, removing empty plates, were as invisible as the architecture, in the sense that their presence was so constant and so unquestioned that the diners did not acknowledge them unless they made an error. Their invisibility was, of course, not a natural condition, but a constructed one, maintained by a web of social convention and the implicit threat of punishment. A slave who was impudent, who failed to maintain the required blank attentiveness, who made too much noise or attracted too much attention, would be reprimanded. A slave who was repeatedly troublesome would be beaten, sold, or both. After the meal, the host might produce a set of dice. Gambling was one of the Romans' great pleasures. Officially illegal, gambling was prohibited except during the Saturnalia festival and universally practiced. Or there might be more wine and more talk, or a performer might arrive, a musician, a reciter, a mime. The evening had its own rhythm, and it ended when it ended, the guests rising to find their sandals, left at the door, and their cloaks, and making their way home through streets that were now, with the sun fully set, genuinely dark. There were no street lights in Roman Pompeii. There were torches and lanterns. People who could afford them carried them, or had a slave carry one. But the streets between the torchlit doorways and the occasional lamp hung at a corner shrine were genuinely dark. Dark in a way that people who have always lived in cities bright with artificial light can barely imagine. Not the dim of a moonless suburban night, but the real, total dark of a pre-electrical world. Walking home from dinner in Pompeii on a moonless night with no lantern was a genuine hazard. There were holes in the pavement. There were the stepping stones across the road junctions that were exactly the right height to catch a foot and send a person sprawling. There were the contents of chamber pots, emptied from upper floor windows by residents who could not or would not use the cesspits landing on the street below. There were, in some areas of the city, people whose intentions were not friendly. The law existed. There was a watchman force. The Tresviri capitals oversaw public order, but there was no police force in the modern sense, no patrol of the streets at night that would materially reduce your risk of encountering someone with bad intentions in a dark alley. If you were robbed in the street at night in Pompeii, you survived it or you didn't, and your legal recourse afterward depended on having witnesses and on being able to identify your attackers, which in the dark was not always possible. You got home. You locked the door. The houses of Pompeii had substantial locks, iron or bronze, operated by keys that were sometimes worn on a finger ring, and in the dark, smaller darkness of your house, you found your way to your bedroom. But before you sleep, let us linger for one more moment in the street, because the streets of Pompeii at night had a quality that is worth dwelling on, if only because it is so completely gone from modern urban life. Without electric light, without the sodium glow of streetlights, without the blue-white wash of illuminated shop windows, the city at night was different in kind, not just in degree. The stars were visible, all of them clearly, the Milky Way a real presence in the sky overhead, not the faint smear that city dwellers today occasionally glimpse, but the full brilliant arch that it is when there is no competing light. The moon, when it was up, cast shadows. When it was not, you navigated by touch, by memory, by the occasional torch at a doorway, by the smell of what you were walking past. A city at night, before artificial light, was an entirely different city from the one it was in the day. The same streets, the same buildings, the same neighbors, but transformed into something that required different senses to navigate, different instincts, a different relationship with the dark. The Romans were not afraid of the dark in the way that children in bright modern bedrooms are afraid of the dark. They lived in it regularly as a fact of life. But they were not careless about it either. They moved carefully. They carried light when they had it. They were alert to the sounds the dark contained. The Romans went to bed earlier than we do and slept differently than we do. The artificial light of lamps and candles was expensive, oil for the lamps, wax or tallow for the candles, and the instinct to conserve it was strong. In summer, when the days were long, people sat outside in the cooling air of the evening after dinner and talked until full dark, then went in. In winter, with its short days, people might be in bed by the 7th or 8th hour of the night, what we would call 8 or 9 in the evening, simply because there was nothing to do in the dark that required light. But the sleep they had was not, it seems, a single consolidated block of 7 or 8 hours. Research into pre-industrial sleep patterns, and there is a body of historical evidence, along with some controlled studies of people living without artificial light, suggest that the first sleep and the second sleep, with a waking period of an hour or two in the middle of the night, was the natural human sleep pattern before artificial light extended the evening and compressed sleep into a single block. Roman and Greek writers describe this waking period in the middle of the night as a time for sex, for prayer, for reflection, for reading by a small lamp, for the kinds of quiet thought that the noise and business of the day prevented. Dreams were taken with a seriousness that a modern secular perspective struggles to fully credit. The Romans had an elaborate taxonomy of dreams: the dream that was a simple reflection of daily experience, the prophetic dream that came from a divine source, the nightmare that came from a demonic one, and a substantial literature of dream interpretation. The Oneirocritica of Artemidorus, written in the 2nd century CEE and surviving in its entirety, is a 5-volume guide to the interpretation of dreams that was widely read and consulted. A Pompeian who dreamed of losing teeth was dreaming of the loss of people close to him. A Pompeian who dreamed of flying was dreaming of social elevation, or in some interpretations, of danger. A Pompeian who dreamed of the gods was potentially receiving a divine communication that required careful interpretation. The bedroom, your cubiculum, was also the space in which prayers to the lares, the household gods, would be offered. The small lararium in the main room of the house was the public face of this devotion. The private prayers of the individual, offered before sleep or upon waking, were their own communion with whatever powers watched over the household. The Romans prayed the way they did most things, pragmatically, with attention to the proper forms, and with the understanding that the gods were entities with whom one had a reciprocal relationship. Do ut des, I give so that you may give. Prayer was less about prostration before the infinite and more about the careful maintenance of a business relationship with very powerful partners. In the dark of your cubiculum, with the city outside settling into its night sounds, the distant cart traffic that was now permitted on the roads, the occasional dog, the voice of someone calling from one building to another, the soft sound of whatever is in the cistern below the atrium, you close your eyes. The mountain to the north is silent. It has been quiet for years, though there have been tremors increasingly in the last few weeks. The grapes on its slopes are fat and almost ready for harvest. The wine this year looks promising. You sleep, and then you do not wake up, or rather, you wake to something you have never experienced in your life, and that no living person in Pompeii has experienced in living memory, because the mountain has not erupted in human memory, and what the mountain is capable of is something that none of the 20,000 people in the city have been required to understand until now. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the 24th of August, or the 23rd of October, if the newer dating is correct, the debate continues. Vesuvius produces a Plinian eruption. The term Plinian is named, with grim appropriateness, after Pliny the Younger, who witnessed the eruption from Misenum across the bay and wrote 2 letters to the historian Tacitus describing what he saw. A Plinian eruption is an eruption of extraordinary violence. The volcanic vent opens, and a column of superheated gas, ash, and pumice is driven upward with sufficient force to reach the stratosphere, rising 15, 20, 30 kilometers into the sky. Pliny describes the eruption cloud as resembling an umbrella pine, the distinctive Italian stone pine with its high, flattened canopy, because that is what the column looked like from 20 kilometers away. A trunk of dark rock and ash driving straight up, then spreading at altitude into a vast canopy that blotted out the sky. In Pompeii, which was downwind of the mountain, the eruption column began dropping material almost immediately. Pumice, pale gray, porous, lightweight chunks of solidified volcanic foam began falling. At first, it was like heavy hail, strange and alarming. Within hours, it was like a blizzard of stone. The pumice accumulated at a rate of up to 15 centimeters per hour. The roofs of buildings, not designed to bear this kind of weight, began to fail. The weight of accumulated pumice on a tiled Roman roof would have been enormous. Estimates suggest that by evening, several hours into the eruption, the depth of pumice in the streets was already over a meter. The sky was dark. This is not a rhetorical description. The eruption column was so vast and so dense with material that it blocked the sun over a wide area. Pliny the Younger, 20 kilometers away at Misenum, describes the darkness as like the darkness inside a sealed room when the lamp is extinguished. Total, complete, disorienting. In Pompeii, at the center of the disaster, the darkness would have been absolute. People stumbled through the pumice fall in complete blackness, their only light the occasional flash of volcanic lightning within the eruption column, which the Romans described as lightning from the mountain. Some tied pillows to their heads with cloth to protect themselves from the falling pumice. This detail comes from Pliny's account of his own experience and tried to keep walking. Some people left the city early in the eruption when leaving was still possible. The road to the south, toward Stabiae, was still passable in the first hours. Those who had carts and horses or donkeys could load what they could carry and go. Those who waited, trying to save more possessions, waiting for a family member who had not come home, unable to move, or simply not believing it would get worse, found as the hours passed that the pumice in the streets was too deep to walk through quickly, that the animals were panicking, that the way was blocked. And then, sometime in the early hours of the next morning, something changed. The eruption column, which had been sustained by the pressure of the volcanic gas and magma below, became unstable. It began to collapse. When a Plinian eruption column collapses, the superheated volcanic material that was being held up by the upward thrust of the gas falls back down the slopes of the volcano as a pyroclastic surge, a fast-moving, ground-hugging cloud of volcanic gas, ash, and rock fragments, traveling at speeds of up to 300 kilometers per hour, at temperatures of between 200 and 700 degrees Celsius. The first surge hit Herculaneum, closer to the volcano to the west, first. The people of Herculaneum who had gathered on the beach, waiting for boats that never came, were killed instantly. We know this because, when the beach was excavated in the 1980s, archaeologists found them exactly as they had been waiting. Hundreds of people in the boathouses and on the shore, killed so fast by the thermal shock that their muscles contracted where they stood, their skeletons preserving the postures of people looking out to sea. Then the surges moved south toward Pompeii. There were several, separated by intervals. Some scholars believe that the first surges were survivable in a sealed space, that a person in a strong stone room with no exposure to the air might have lived through the first one. Some of the body positions suggest this. People who appear to have been sheltering, who had time to cover their faces, whose postures suggest not the instantaneous shock of the first heat, but the slower agony of suffocating in the superheated air. The final, largest surge brooked no shelter. The people of Pompeii, who had not left, and many had not left, for the same reasons that people in every natural disaster fail to leave. They believed it would not be that bad. They were waiting for a family member. They were elderly or infirm. They were enslaved and could not leave without permission. They were trying to save their valuables. They thought the worst was over. Those people died within seconds of the pyroclastic surge's arrival. Not from the ash or the gas, though both were lethal. Not from the heat, though the heat was lethal. They died from the instantaneous thermal shock of air at several hundred degrees, which caused their muscles to contract in the distinctive frozen postures that the casts made from the voids in the ash have preserved for 2,000 years. The casts are the most intimate thing that Pompeii has left us. When archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli, working at the site in the 1860s, discovered that the spaces in the ash where bodies had decomposed were hollow, and that pouring plaster into them before excavating created a perfect mold of the body at the moment of death. The posture, the expression, in some cases the fabric of the clothing, the features of the face, the result was something that has never been described with complete adequacy. There are cast figures that are mundane, a man curled on his side, sleeping looking, as if the volcano just caught him at rest. There are cast figures that are harrowing, a man with his arm over his face, trying to breathe through his cloak. There is the famous family group, an adult man, an adult woman, two children, found together, the children pressed against the adults, the postures unmistakably those of a family, trying to protect each other in the last moments. There is the dog, found still on its chain, twisted in its death agony in a pose that no one who has seen it has been able to look at easily. They were just people, living a day, then not. The volcano that destroyed Pompeii also preserved it. This is the great paradox at the heart of everything we know about the city. The same material that killed 20,000 people in a single morning sealed their world so completely that it waited essentially intact for 17 centuries until the first workers began digging again in the 18th century and uncovering what lay beneath. The rediscovery of Pompeii, beginning in the 1740s under the patronage of the Bourbon King Charles of the Two Sicilies, was one of the defining intellectual events of the 18th century. The world that it revealed was so complete, so vivid, and so specific that it sent shockwaves through European art, architecture, and philosophy. The neoclassical movement in European design, the sharp lines, the Roman decorative motifs, the columned facades that show up in buildings from Washington to Edinburgh, owes a direct and acknowledged debt to the discoveries at Pompeii. The city came back into the world and promptly began reshaping it. What they uncovered, and what archaeologists continue to uncover even now, new excavations are ongoing and discoveries continue to make international news, is not a ruin in the usual sense. It is a world. It is a world of particular scale and density, human in the specific way that only daily life can be. The street, the bread counter, the water fountain, the paint on the walls, the graffiti, the forgotten ring, the carbonized loaf still in the oven where the baker left it, the inscription on the wall still pointing to the brothel 2 streets over, the sleeping dog, the child's writing practice, the half-eaten meal. There is a bakery in Pompeii, the bakery of Modestus, where 81 carbonized loaves of bread were found in the oven when the building was excavated. 81 loaves, placed in the oven perhaps an hour before the eruption began, never taken out, never eaten. They have been sitting there for 2,000 years. You can see photographs of them. The loaves are stamped with a circular pattern, dividing them into segments, the way Roman bread was habitually scored for easy breaking and sharing at table. The stamp names the baker. In that detail, the baker's name pressed into bread that no one ever ate. There is something that resists eloquent summary. The skeletons of Pompeii, analyzed with modern techniques, have told us remarkable things about the people who lived there. Stable isotope analysis of bones tells archaeologists about diet, what people ate regularly, whether they had moved to Pompeii from elsewhere, what level of nutritional stress they experienced in childhood. The Pompeian population shows a wide range. Some individuals, with diets very rich in fish and high quality protein, consistent with a prosperous lifestyle. Others with diets that suggest a much simpler and more restricted access to food. The bones of enslaved people, identifiable through their skeletal wear patterns and the context in which they were found, show the physical damage of heavy, repetitive labor beginning in childhood, spinal compression, joint damage, the telltale signatures of a lifetime of carrying heavy loads in constrained positions. For all the ways in which Pompeian daily life was genuinely alien, the slavery, the death, the smell, the violence, the lead pipes, the gods on every wall, it was also recognizably human in ways that reach across 20 centuries with startling ease. People fell in love and advertised it on walls. People argued with their neighbors. People ran for office and tried to get their friends to vote for them. People ate lunch at the food counter and went to the baths and came home and lay down in the dark and wondered about tomorrow. One graffito from Pompeii reads, in its entirety, "Nothing can last forever. The sun, which has shone so brightly, is drowned in the sea. The moon, which has just risen, returns to nothing. Every wind that blows so fiercely is stilled. It was scratched into a wall by an unknown hand at an unknown date for an unknown reason. It is a small, philosophical scrap. It is the kind of thing a person writes when they are in a certain mood, late in the evening thinking about time. It survived the volcano, the centuries, the digs, and it is now part of the permanent record of a human life. The person who wrote it did not know that. They just wrote it. They were thinking about impermanence, and they wrote it on a wall in a city that would shortly become one of the most permanent things in the whole history of human civilization. Tomorrow did not come for them in the way they expected. It usually doesn't, for any of us. But the record of what they were, the 11,000 pieces of writing, the extraordinary buildings, the art, the surgical instruments, the food, the casts of the dead, that remains, and it will remain. You are safe wherever you are listening from. The mountain that shadows your particular evening is quiet. The ordinary day that belongs to you, its textures, its inconveniences, its small pleasures, is yours to keep for a while yet. Rest now. If you're still here, still listening, or just now waking up from something that felt almost like sleep, thank you, genuinely. Thank you for spending this time in a city that no longer exists with people who have been gone for 2,000 years. I find something deeply worthwhile in that, and I hope you do too. If this helped you drift off, or if this channel has become a regular companion for the hours between the end of the day and the beginning of sleep, the kindest thing you can do is subscribe. It takes one tap, and it makes a real difference for this little channel. You can do it now, or you can do it in the morning when you remember. There's no rush, and there's no pressure. Leave a comment if the mood takes you. Tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every one of them, always with something warm to drink, and they genuinely make my day. The next story is already waiting. There are so many left to tell. Sleep well. Good night.